destinations over the last 15 years now, I think, OJ. So we need a bit of an anniversary on the old purple flag, I think. Okay, so I've got a little bit, Sylvia's asked me to do a little presentation, perhaps some scene setting about nighttime economy and hospitality, and perhaps what it's worth and its importance culturally, economically and socially to the UK. So I'll do that, and then maybe that can get everybody's juices going. Okay, so just share my screen. Here we go. Okay, so in terms of, I've been measuring the nighttime economy since 2009, and we're involved in another major project, which one of the contributors here might talk about at some point, but I can't divulge any of that yet, but that will be a next step on in how we've measured the UK evening and nighttime economy. So I'm just going to give you some existing figures and some background at the moment. Hold on. There we go. So back in 2009, we first measured the UK nighttime economy, and a figure which still gets used now is that £66 billion figure. We updated it last year using 2019 data, and we saw that it rose to about £92 billion in terms of its turnover of all those businesses in those sectors you see above. In terms of gross value added, that's what the Treasury likes to know about. That's how much, if you're an individual business, I guess it's the same as profit. It's not quite the same, but you can think about it in those terms, and it adds about £34 billion worth of value added. That's the difference between inputs and outputs to UK PLC. And over the last 10 years, it's gone from 1.3 million jobs to 1.5 million jobs. And I'm not giving you this year's figures or last year's pandemic figures. I'll come to those in a minute. But what we do know about it is it's one of the most useful success stories about how the UK economy has grown over the last 10 years. And it's been pretty resilient up until recent times. If you situate that within the wider UK leisure and hospitality industry, evening and nighttime economy plus accommodation, which is the biggest sector, additionally catering, conventions, events and stuff, it's about 50% of that. So in terms of jobs, and we can't underestimate how important UK hospitality is to UK PLC in terms of there's over 3 million jobs involved in it. Less than now for obvious reasons, and again in terms of the gross value added to UK PLC, it's about £72 billion. That makes it the third largest employer in the UK. The evening and nighttime economy as an industry is the 10th largest employer, and by comparison, if you look at that £92 billion per annum compared to like automotive industry, telecoms, fashion, you can pick pretty much anything apart from retail and UK finances, and it will be a larger industry. And that's a story that often isn't told, and we need to keep telling about this industry that we love. In terms of the impact of the pandemic, so we said, well, can you perhaps tell us a little bit about what the impact has been? Well, using some CGA data, there's been over the last year 3 closures in hospitality for every single opening. We've lost 12,000 venues. Some of those will come back, of course, but some are certainly gone for good. And one of the challenges that we've got is this is by no means the worst at this point in time, right? So what we're going to be seeing over the next 6 months is the closure of those venues across all sectors, which have been up through furloughs and rent deferrals, which I'm sure our other panelists will be very keen to talk about in due course. If we look at live music as a key player in our evening and nighttime economy in our town city centres, revenues last year were down 81%. 3/4 of staff were put on furlough, and eventually 55% of those working in that industry, including all the supply chains, were made redundant last year. That's left often founders, managers and core skeleton staff. They all need to be re-employed as we pick up, and for those businesses that survive through it. I thought I'd talk a little bit more about the town centre impact, because these are the ecosystems in which all of those uses sit, or nearly all of them. We've lost 17,500 stores, although we have had some new ones open up over the last year, but 10,000 a net loss. And there's a real challenge that we're facing, and OJ might want to pick up a bit more on that, which is that CBRE and instant offices were estimating around 50% of office jobs now will involve a much greater working from home element to them. And CBRE looked at suggesting probably about 30% of all office space will become vacant over the next few years. And we need to think about how we're going to repurpose all of that. And the challenge, as I mentioned earlier, is that it's by no means over. The biggest challenge, I think, probably is back rent that's due. Mike will probably talk a bit about that in terms of that, not just on the evening and nighttime economy businesses, but on all of those businesses that had rent deferrals. We're going to see a lot more distressed sales. We look at the literature around that, and banks taking further action on those businesses that they see as weak, as having weak business models or not being able to make their repayments. That all sounds pretty grim. I think there is some good news, as we've seen over the last few weeks. Consumer demand is high, both in on-street retail. There's huge queues in Oxford Street over the weekend. And obviously there's huge demand when the weather allows for outside drinking and eating. I think it's probably worth mentioning that I don't think the recovery is going to be uniform. So we might see some good early signs, but some places such as coastal towns, we'd expect them to do well over the summer, but major cities that are reliant on office populations at lunchtime and international tourists are going to really struggle. I mean, London, particularly Edinburgh, Manchester, Liverpool, perhaps to a lesser extent, are going to take longer to recover than those that will benefit from this year's staycation, if you have indeed been able to book anywhere. In terms of the type of venues, so rural pubs, neighbourhood venues probably do pretty well. People are still quite nervous about travelling back into big city centres for a night out. And then there's some areas that some sectors that are really going to be deeply problematic, and I'll let the other speakers talk about those in terms of how we get festivals without insurance that we've all been asking for, live music scene back, and in terms of nightclubs, and obviously Mike can talk about that. I think there's one positive out of it, which is that over the last 10 years since the last Great Recession, the evening and nighttime economy industry and the hospitality industry grew back at twice the pace of the rest of the economy. It did fantastically for those 10 years and was doing so up to 2019. I think there's a slight caveat to that, which is that we really probably overexpanded in some areas, such as chain restaurants, in terms of some of the branded outlets. And I suspect that what will do well is those independents, authentic businesses that are really doing something different, who have been able to survive over the current year and coming 6 months. They will be in ever greater demand in our town and city centres. But for me, I still think that looking at the statistics over the last 10 years, people still want to go out, and I think demand is there for the right offer in our town and city centres. And I just thought I'd conclude by saying that I've only seen a few places actually have a coherent strategy about how they're going to come out of the pandemic for their town and city centres. I've got some good examples from around the world that I can talk about, but the one I've seen best of recent in the UK is the one from the City of London, which is looking at how they can diversify who's coming to the City of London, who stays there, who lives there, how they're going to animate that place, how they're going to repurpose all of that empty stock that they're likely to have. And they've come up with a new vision for it, which sort of looks at how they can pedestrianise more spaces. One of them we're probably all familiar with, around the Bank of England and Bank tube station. Got some quite bold visions for that. And what I'd like to see is more places, not necessarily quite as big or financially muscular as the City of London, but anywhere can have a vision for how we're going to come out of this to support our leisure and hospitality industry and our evening and nighttime economy. So I'll leave it on that. I hope that's of some use, Sylvia.
Thank you, Alistair. Yeah, well, I'm sure everybody will agree with me. That was a really good summary, really fascinating. And actually, we have such a broad range of experience and angles here. So I guess the first question is really, I'm going to throw it open to the panelists, is from Alistair's presentation, or thinking more broadly around the topic, what are the challenges that in your specific area of expertise and knowledge that, which of those do you agree with? Are there extras? And also, what are the opportunities going forward that you think? So from your particular perspective, if I throw that over to Mike first at the NTIA.
Thanks, Sylvia. Really, really nice to be picked out of the hat straight away there. It's interesting, actually. I mean, I was on a Bays call earlier on the resilience of the sector, particularly hospitality and nighttime economy. And I just really wanted to focus or talk about some of the challenges that we've got ahead of us. Reopening, we obviously know the roadmap, but we've got this long sort of this legacy position that we're working through at the moment, which is all centered around confidence. And confidence in terms of investment, confidence in terms of landlords allowing and leasing, confidence in terms of banking, and also confidence in terms of workforce and people returning to the jobs and roles that they had before. Because as you can appreciate, that the future has been so tethered by different sort of measures put in place by government, and these tranches of last minute sort of communications have caused some quite a level of distress, particularly in the financial services, where hospitality and late night economy have really struggled in terms of credit, loans, and some of these things that have even been laid out by government, but still not fulfilled by the banking system, which is horrendous, really. So our sector has categorically been prone or put in a position where the confidence level across much of those reliant sectors, both workforce, landlords, two of the biggest costs that we have as a sector, as well as the banking sector, that it's presented us with a very, very difficult position. And a lot of the conversations this morning were about growing sort of financial resilience. Part of it is about presenting the right narrative in terms of us re-engaging. There's no doubt that our position in terms of entrepreneurial spirit and the levels of return will be there, but we need to balance the debt position with it not just covering our standing costs, but starting to look at growth. And that's a big issue. One of the big issues that we're facing at the moment, I'm sure that I'll go on to, is this rent debt legacy that seems to be sort of very clear. There are lots of narratives. Last night at 11:45, we had to have the evidence in. But if I'm going to be honest, I don't think anyone that I know filled out the 93 questionnaire that was out there. We did it separately. I mean, even the 93 questions had no real relevance. They were driven towards an outcome that the government really required, which was frustrating at best. So we're all trying to present evidence to show some sort of shared burden scheme which allowed a fair approach to the debt legacy, and then to move forward for us to start contemplating how, if there is an intervention that the government can put in place to allow us to move forward. Because before we get anywhere, staff and rent have got to be some of the key things we need to manage in terms of our reopening and how we're going to move forward, particularly with the moratorium coming at the end of the June. And we've seen a lot of the associations come out press-wise to highlight this. So there's a lot of work to do at the moment. I still don't believe that the government are going to come out with a solution. I think they're going to push it further down the road. I've just seen a submission from Land Registry to suggest, and this was quite interesting, and this was a landlord-based solution for commercial tenants, which was about they should just withdraw the restrictions in terms of the moratorium at the end of June and allow a 6-month breathing period for people to resolve their position between landlord and leaseholder. At which point I sort of sat back and laughed and said, yeah, this is just setting it up for a fall. So I think there's some interesting narratives, both from our perspective as an industry and from a landlord perspective, on how this is workable. It needs intervention, it needs infrastructure, it needs adjudication of some sort. Mediation is going to play a part in it, but it's one of the biggest hurdles that we need to overcome to actually get to that point, alongside being able to reopen and understand the measures that we are going to be able to have to reopen to, which are the big challenges across different types of businesses. So shall I pause there for the minute?
Yes, thank you. That's a very excellent points, well made, and obviously I'm sure a lot of the rest of the panel had a lot to say about that. One thing, I guess, from this perspective, this audience is also understanding what they can do to help with any of that, because obviously you as an organisation lobbying government, is there anything that you think on a practical sort of town or city centre level that regulators and place managers and other people involved in these partnerships? Is there something practical they can do that you can think of to support the businesses that they work with on those?
Yeah, I think the one thing that came up this morning with Davies is we were sat talking about what measures can be put in place in terms of infrastructure support. We've seen in London that there is no night tube that's not going to be available until 2022. So I don't know how they think people at 1 till 5 in the morning are going to get home, but that's going to be a novelty for neighbours and communities. So there are some considerations need to be taken into account for nighttime economy. There is the other element to this is we've seen an extension of hours through retail to allow for them to make up that loss. And retail of all the sectors have not been the hardest hit, but it seems that we are secondary in terms of considering extension of hours or the capacity to trade or change the trading platform that we're looking at, whether that looks at planning, whether that looks at outdoor areas, which I know have been successful short term, which are not a long-term fix as we move into the winter, but definitely hours is a consideration. The concern is that, you know, where we're regulated so heavily and etc., that's going to be a closed door. And it concerns me the fact that retail have had this opportunity and haven't suffered the hardship of some of the later night economy businesses. And I feel quite rightly that people present and operate in the right way should be given the opportunity to be considered for later hours or an extension of hours, or, you know, the ability to use or repurpose or pivot. You know, there should be some flexibility there, because I think that's going to make the difference long term for people to gain back some of that cash reserve that they've lost and had to use to sustain their position. I mean, the irony about this, and I'll bring this back to one point, CRF funding, and Sylvia, you know this better than anybody, the amount of times that the Arts Council sent back the reason that a business did not get grant funding was it wasn't adaptable, is a complete insult. I mean, we are sat here where businesses have survived 12 months, 14, 15 months even, you know, obviously with ongoing restrictions, and their excuse not to fund is they haven't been adaptable. The fact that they've lasted this long has just shown how adaptable they are. So you can imagine the frustration, the human element of this has been a real consideration that has not been taken into account by government. And I probably will, definitely the local authority and the police, to consider their approach when they're dealing with people, particularly as most of them are on their last sort of nerve, their last sort of tranche of trying to keep their head above water. You know, an oppressive environment rather than a collaborative environment is the difference between people throwing in the towel and potentially, you know, putting themselves in a challenging sort of well-being or mental health position. So that's just one consideration I would bring up.
Great, thanks. I'm going to bring Dan in, then I'm going to bring Sacha in, because obviously they've got you know, current operators. I'm sure they've got something to say around those topics. So
okay, cheers, Sylvia, and thanks, Mike. I mean, I agree with, you know, your points there. I mean, in my case, I mean, but both Sacha and I sit on the regulation side and we sit on an operations side, so we really are right in the middle of it. And also, it allows you to sort of look at the different rules and regulations. And I know there's been a lot of temporary sort of changes and measures in place. One of the issues is that because it's been so fluid, you know, with stopping and starting, lockdowns and things like that, for most businesses, it's very hard to do any sort of plan. So, I mean, in our case, we were renovating, regenerating the area. So, sorry, I'm just making a noise in the room. Can you just keep the volume down? I'm actually doing, yeah, it's all right, thanks. Sorry about that. Stuff. Put me off the bloody train of thought now. Yeah, so basically we were regenerating a lot of places, and when we were closing down and we're thinking, well, what are our reserves looking like? I mean, because do we stop building work? Do we, you know, and then we've got to alter the places. So outside areas is a good one. So, you know, a lot of local authorities have exercised some pavement pragmatism and have allowed people to open up outside and to at least get some trade in. Difficulty is we're 100% reliant on the weather. So being 100% reliant on British weather is not a good thing. And what that means is you get this sort of situation where, you know, as Mike said, there's a lot of operators, a lot of single site operators, a lot of small groups that are literally, it's the last throw of the dice for them. And that, between now, I look at the last few days, it's been hailstorming here. And that means that we can't open 3 of our 4 venues. So when you're trying to even do a rota for a week, it's very challenging. And that I think that having everyone working together, the people who are on this, listening to this now, there's a mixture of people who are operators, regulators, police, licensing, planners, everything. And I think it's just so important for us to work together, because if we don't, and that if a bit of pavement pragmatism isn't exercised, you're going to see a massive amount of failures. And then what is the knock-on from that? Because in lockdown, we saw when high streets were closed and that there was, just a few late night places open, like, an off license or convenience store or, fast food place. What it means is that there's a big security aspect to this as well, because for the last 30 years, the government has been outsourcing supervision. So we've had the SIA set up, which is working well, and it's a national scheme. We've had a lot of license to practice courses, and with my old sort of business was CPL training groups. So we used to train considerable amounts of people, a couple of million courses a year, and a lot of them were in sort of license to practice areas. So I just look at the street we're on and speak to residents and neighbours. And quite often they wouldn't feel safe coming out at night when the whole street is closed, apart from a few sharp, drafts of light from a local convenience store or the local takeaway. And you then start getting antisocial behaviour building up. When you have a concentration of licensed premises that have, in a lot of cases, door supervisors, they have managers, assistant managers, they're all, either DPSs or personal license holders, you've got a certain amount of safety and security and numbers of places being open and vibrancy. So putting the economic side, to one side at the moment, I think it's looking on a security level as well. It's very concerning. So these things, I think, need to be addressed properly. And I've actually got a very good relationship with the licensing department here. And we, every few nights we walk around, we look at what's happening outside. And, the other day, one of them said, well, look, Dan, you've got 4 tables outside. It's like 8 tables outside Rockpoint Records from the bar, only licensed for 4. Now I said, okay, but also we've both been discussing, kids on bikes, groups of kids hanging around, and a bit of an overlap from lockdown, and actually positioning and placemaking different offers outside on the pavement quite often stops like gangs of kids congregating around. So it's a policing sort of issue as well, and we've worked with the police to sort of do that. So I think there's got to be a bit of give and take. The industry has been decimated really by some of the decisions. And just one final point, just to really echo what the lack of thinking in some of the policies. For example, the 10 o'clock curfew, which was an absolute, train wreck. Because anyone who's been in the industry knows, IOL, we regulate anything, we look into and deal with all different types of licensing, one of them being taxis. If you've got every single licensed taxi driver to be on duty at 10 o'clock at night, you still couldn't get people away from the venues. And it meant that, obviously the restraint of trade that we had and the restrictions there, but also then put a huge surge out onto the streets and the ensuing sort of issues that has. Where what we're doing at the moment is actually, and this is voluntarily, so it's eating into our hours, but in order to keep that surge away, we close our venues.
Well, I think we've lost you for a moment, Dan. I don't know if your internet has gone a bit.
I'll shut earlier than I have to, in a staggered stage format, so we don't. So basically, we don't ditch a load of people on the street. So it's going to be give and take and pavement pragmatism.
We lost you for a minute there, Dan, but I think your point was that you have a number of the venues and you do sort of rolling closures so that you're not all.
Yeah, that's it. Sort of rolling closures. It's sort of, and that's eating into our time where we basically close half an hour. You know, each one eats into our time, but it means it doesn't have a big surge of people on the streets. Yeah,
it's a really good point. And actually, we have had a question in there that sort of dovetails into this, and then I'll come on to you if that's okay, Sacha. But just one for you, Dan. David Kaner has said, you know, to Mike's point about extension of hours into the late and early morning and sort of opening up, allowing possibility for additional trading hours, I guess, for the licensed trade. He said, how could this be done whilst still supporting the licensing objectives? Because public nuisance, crime and disorder problems arise once people leave. Allowing premises to open later will increase this type of issue, especially.
Well, it doesn't increase it. It does exactly the opposite. People don't want to stay most of the time very late, but they want to go. And if they say, okay, a taxi's 20 minutes wait or half an hour wait, they can stay in a venue, supervised, and they can leave. And that was the whole point of the new sort of licensing act, that it gives people a staggered response, you know, where they can leave. And it gives public transport, taxis, the right amount of time to get people away.
Yeah, and actually, I guess the other point is that at the moment with this COVID landscape we're still kind of dealing with, it enables kind of social distancing or sort of management of crowds and stuff. It's a lot
easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. I'll hand over to Sacha to give his perspective on the conversation so far.
No, thanks, Sylvia. And yeah, I agree completely with every single thing that Mike said and what Dan said. I mean, just to reiterate Dan's point about some of the decisions that this government has made, and you probably expect me to say this, but the 10 p.m. curfew is absolute nonsense. You know, every year when I put Parklife Festival on, the capacity of 80,000 people, every single SAG that I sit in, one of the first questions is, how do you egress 80,000 people at the same time? And the answer is you can't. You've got to turn volumes off at different times to create a staggered egress. So actually, you know, Dan's completely right. By pushing hundreds of thousands of people out at exactly the same time, not only could the transport not support it, but what do we think would happen? Of course, they piled into the supermarkets. Of course, they went back to after parties to mix in households. And actually, that decision probably spread the virus and did more harm than good. Another ridiculous decision was the substantial meal rule, the whole debate regarding the Scotch egg that, you know, we took them to judicial review and compelled them to drop that. Again, it was absolute and utter nonsense. I think Alistair's presentation, which was fantastic, a really good summary, there were probably 2 points that I'd like to pick up on. The second one being festival insurance, obviously wear my Parklife hat, warehouse budget hat. But I think you said something, Alistair, that is absolutely right, and I absolutely 100% support it, and I've said it from the outset during lockdown 1. And it's this: the bigger the city centre, the harder it's going to be to recover. That is absolute fact. You know, we've seen the decimation of the high street, the large stores, Debenhams, Topshop, Topman, Dorothy Perkins, Wallace's, Burton's, all gone. Huge retail units, actually, you know. What sort of sector can fill those? It's the nighttime economy. If you think about theatres, live music venues, restaurants, bars, nightclubs, not many people are going to rush to retail at the moment to open up retail. And I'm not saying COVID killed that particular sector off, but it certainly expedited it. So there is an opportunity coming out of this. And you know, Alistair, you mentioned London, and I think about the tourists that go. I'm in London next week, actually, for the Brits, but you know, I think about the tourism that goes into London this summer. That's gone. That's finished. You take away the offices as well. You know, there's no lunchtime trade. There's no drinks after work. That's gone. It is going to be so hard for the city centres to recover. They will recover, but they will be the last ones to recover. And I spoke to a landlord during lockdown 1, a landlord in Soho, actually. And a lot of his premises were nightclubs, bars, parts of the nighttime economy. And he said, he was an elderly chap, really switched on. And he said to me, he'd lived through recession, depressions before, and coming out of it, he said, you imagine you drop a pebble into a lake and the ripple effect comes out of it. That pebble's the city centre, and the ripple effect is where the success spreads to our suburbs. Now, I think because of our mentality, the way we've been retrained during the last 15 months, that when we do reopen, people are going to start staying more local, rather than having to take public transport, rather than the added expensive taxes and all the hassle. I think people are going to start supporting the local pub, the local restaurants, and staying within the 15-minute walk. So, you know, it is going to be hard for the city centres to recover, but at exactly the same time, this could be a real moment for our suburbs to shine. And, you know, I'm not saying this because he's here. I've told it to his face. Before COVID, Dan was very kind enough to put a day aside, and he showed me around New Brighton and what they've done there. And he's by himself regenerated a town centre, something that he was passionate about as a kid. He was left, it became derelict, and he's brought it back to life again. And he'll be able to tell you much better, but he's got systems to him where you can open a restaurant, but you've got to buy off the local grocer and things like that. I mean, it's absolutely incredible what they've done. But yeah, the high streets now, we are going to see a huge difference when we do unlock. And, you know, Alistair, you're talking about retail coming back. I'm seeing it slightly differently in Manchester. There was most definitely a honeymoon period, but it does feel like it's tailed off a little bit from the stats we're seeing. Festival insurance, it's a huge one for me. We saw Glastonbury cancel. And the reason why Glastonbury cancelled wasn't because they thought possibly COVID could happen. They didn't see a roadmap or anything. The reason it cancelled was because it takes 3 to 4 months to build Glastonbury. It's literally a city. And they could not risk putting staff on site with a COVID outbreak without insurance. Boomtown have cancelled. I was in a select committee back in January calling out for this festival insurance. Other major countries, Germany, France, Switzerland, Austria, Spain, have come with a government-backed indemnity insurance. And, many, many other festivals will fall by the wayside unless they come forward. I think the good news is, for the first time ever last week, we did start to hear some positive noises coming out of it. It's been a flat no up until that point. But I think they've realised now with this roadmap of the 21st of June, which they seem absolutely adamant to stick to, thankfully, they're going to have to start looking at festivals, because I think they didn't get it to begin with. There's a whole ecology around those festivals. When Parklife takes place in Manchester, forget what happens in the perimeter of Heaton Park, but outside the perimeter, it generates £17 million during that weekend in terms of taxis, restaurants, hotels, new outfits. They've started to clock on now the domino effect of these festivals not happening. The freelancers, we've seen them, they've rebranded themselves, the excluded. They're the people behind the scenes that you don't see, the people that do our sound, lights. They create the whole festival. They've had no real support since the 16th of March last year. They need that support. And the whole, the suppliers on site, the sound companies, the light companies, the tent companies, the portaloos, the trackway, the fencing, they will fall by the wayside if this government-backed insurance is not put in place this summer. It is absolutely critical. And I actually think now, Sylvia, actually is time critical, because, I am holding suppliers. I'm in a slightly fortunate position. Parklife's a big festival, but I'm holding suppliers back at the moment saying, need to give me a few more weeks. Same with artists. I'm extremely confident Parklife's going to happen. No social distancing, no masks. It's 80,000, but we're in the middle of September. Those festivals are to July now. I think we're going to start to see them fall by the wayside. And I actually feel really sorry. It's the smaller independent festivals that are going to fall first. And they're the ones who, they risk their own money, their friends' money, their family's money. And without those smaller boutique festivals, the likes of Parklife, Creamfields, Leeds, Reading, they're not going to survive, because you need that talent chain line to build up to it. So yeah, the big thing I would say to anybody on this call is any support you can give for festival insurance is needed. Thank you.
Thanks, Sacha. I'm aware that we're going to be losing you and Mike in about 20 minutes, so I will come back to you in a second with some other questions. But I'm interested in this idea of, I guess, the delicate ecosystem that we're all describing around our own areas of expertise, and how actually the impacts of what's happened in the last year haven't all been fully felt. And you know, a lot of the people on the call are kind of preempting that, can see down the line some of what they predict might happen to, you know, the supply chain, et cetera, et cetera. And I just wondered if who might want to jump in and talk about, you know, some of those, perhaps someone like Alistair, if you've not spoken yet. I don't know if there's anything that you can add around that in terms of perhaps sort of policy decisions that might be made around towns and city centres. I'm thinking particularly, spoke to OJ this morning around cumulative impact policies. Well, they come in where you see a spike in crime. Can you foresee a future where policymakers may decide to bring something like that in based on 2021 crime stats versus 2020 versus not 2019? Those kind of things that might be kind of unintended consequences of the pandemic that we have to look out for.
Yeah, okay, very briefly then. So cumulative impact areas, for those people that don't know them, are areas where there's high levels of public nuisance, public safety issues. This goes back to some of the stuff Dan's talking about. And councils can bring in a cumulative impact area, which makes it more difficult to either open a new premises or extend an existing one physically in terms of space or in terms of later operating hours, which goes back to one of the questions we've had in the Q&A and what Dan was talking about. I don't really want to get into the rights or wrongs of them. I'll let other people do that because they do a lot of measurement around them. However, what I would say is that quite a few authorities have either abandoned them this year or have temporarily suspended them. So there's been about 6 or 7 authorities with about, I suppose, about 15, 20 cumulative impact areas in their towns and cities between them. And the methodology the methodology behind the thinking on it has varied. Some places, you know, crime and disorder has just disappeared. So they've just said, you know, essentially last year in 2020, we've got very little of it. So why have we got a policy? Perhaps we can be more flexible, certainly for a year or two as the industry recovers, which I think is one route you can go down as a council. And bear in mind, there's about 280 of these areas across England and Wales. It's different in Scotland and Northern Ireland. Or some places have fully abandoned them altogether. And so they've said that you know, they don't feel it's right anymore. And one of the things that I think I've heard when I'm talking to some of the licensing officers there and some of the operators in those locations is kind of British drinking culture has changed a lot. And we've shifted to a much more food-oriented culture over the last 10 years, a lot more entertainment, experiential, live music, etc. And I think you know, a lot of areas, there are still some areas. Someone mentioned Soho here, and clearly that is a challenging part of London to manage. It's fantastic, but yes, it does have a lot of crime and disorder there. But I think because British culture has changed over the last 10 years, I think there's now an opportunity to look at being more flexible, particularly for the kinds of venues that we want to get back into our towns and city centres. So not many places really want mass volume vertical drinking venue anymore. And in reality, the market for that is massively reduced from what it was 10 or 15 years ago. We're much more interested in venues that are about performance, community spaces. There might be art galleries. There might be pubs that, you know, that are food led. There might be community owned spaces. There's a growth of those out there. And so I suppose what I would commend is that people are watching could start thinking about, if their local authority hasn't already considered it, you know, if they have a cumulative impact area, perhaps that policy is time for review, even if, you know, legally they don't have to review it now. Maybe it's now the time to have a discussion about what could be done to flex it to support the industry.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you, Alistair. Another policy change that we see coming in the future that could have a huge impact, I was talking to OJ about it this morning, is obviously the permitted development change. And I'm going to hand over to OJ around some of the challenges that might come about with that.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia. So I think I'll probably start off in terms of explaining this point. I'll start off with something Mike raised, and that is the issue of debt. So at the recent budget in March, we heard about the debt that sits with the government as a result of COVID. I've heard from businesses in the evening and nighttime economy the amount of debt they've amassed, which is a real challenge. And then recently there was an article in the Financial Times suggesting that property owners had also accumulated around £4.2 billion worth of debt across the UK. So that's commercial landlords. So we've got a challenge right across the chain. And for me, it needs a proper strategy to deal with that debt in a way which is sensible. And I think the ideas around shared burden for me are entirely sensible, because when that debt starts to accumulate in any one part of the change, that's when you're looking at some form of systemic economic collapse as a result of that. So it's a massive problem. Unfortunately, the solutions I've seen coming forward so far are ones which I think could really decimate town centres and high streets in England because of this idea of permitted development. So for those people that don't know, in England, as part of the planning system, what we have, and it's the same across the UK, but it's what's called a use class order system. And that means local planning authorities have a measure of control of what any commercial property can be used for. So it would have been fairly recently that a local planning authority can't tell you what type of shop you might have in any particular property. They can't tell you if it's going to be a Tesco or a Sainsbury's or a Topshop or whatever, but they can say this property is shop and it can't be anything else. And if a property owner wanted to change the use, they would need to go through planning permission to do that. Late last year, that got changed so that there's much more flexibility across different commercial uses. A shop can become a restaurant, can become a cafe, can become a bank without the need for planning permission. So now commercial property owners can just get on and make the change. Now, we broadly agree with that because the way economies are changing so quickly, we need flexibility. And to be honest, seeing leisure and hospitality come in place of retail, which we know is struggling, I haven't got a problem with. So let's allow that flexibility. The next step, however, which is coming in from the 1st of August, is the government saying that all of those uses, shops, restaurants, cafes, banks, offices, nurseries, post office, whatever it is, can be converted to housing without planning permission. And that's where you see a massive change in the type of character of use. Now, for me, you can't do something like that without planning permission. For residents, you need to have the right services around them because the services they need are completely different from the services needed by a business. When it comes to mixing residents with evening and nighttime economy uses, I have a real problem of what that means for some established businesses in the nighttime economy, because we've seen, unless there's agent of change principles in place, that can be a real problem for those businesses. So I'm concerned about that. It could mean, when we're talking about that debt sitting with individual businesses and property owners getting concerned about their own debt because they've got banks knocking on their door saying they have to meet their financial obligations, then I'm concerned. And when we also have a shortage of supply in terms of housing, the easy thing for any commercial property owner to do is to evict the business and put in place residential instead, because that makes sense for their bottom line. And actually, there's a number of property owners that, in terms of taking a long-term perspective in how you create a destination that works for their bottom line in the long term, they hate the idea because you will get this ad hoc change, which can completely break the character of a destination. And I'm very concerned about what this means for the health of many businesses across the evening and nighttime economy.
Okay. I'll just echo your point there, because I think it's very important. Where you've got high streets failing and, you know, bricks and mortar businesses closing, Sacha's just run down some of the big ones, but also lots of little ones as well. And the move to online, this whole, you know, lockdown of thing has just accelerated it. If you drive from, I mean, this is what I've been talking to my local authority about. Planning and licensing are notoriously horrific at communicating. So even if they're in the same building, they can be on the same corridor, they never speak to each other. And that's when these complete disasters that build up problems for the future. Now, if you literally walk out the door here and drive to the town hall, you will see exactly what you've just said there. And it's an old high street. And literally every 2 or 3 shops along there's one which is bricked up the front with a UPVC plastic door, and it's a residence. Now, what is that road then? Because it's not a high street anymore. It's literally this mismatch, and some are done, better than others. But when you drive down it, you get a sense of, what is this I'm driving through? There's no thinking behind it. And also you build up problems from the future. There's 453 odd councils in the UK, and my council is the worst for housing. It's 453rd. So I have this in spades around here, where it's literally they are putting, just putting houses up, taking kids' play areas down and putting affordable housing and things there. It never happens in the affluent areas. It happens in a sort of blue collar, sort of areas that are being forgotten. And then it's very, very hard to undo that. So when you do have that sort of loose, you can just change it to a residence. Really, how to get it back is compulsory purchase after that. And that is a very, that's a long drawn out process that might or might not work. So I think getting this right now is so important, because all it does is it stores up a load of problems for the future.
Yeah, can I just come back on that? Because I know Sacha and Mike have to go and I want to come back in. So I'm just going to quickly come back to that. Yeah, Dan, agree with everything you say. I'm going to go further than that. I'd say when you get massive change from commercial to residential, de facto, it's not a high street anymore. It's not a town centre. There's no one universal definition for what a town centre actually is. But in every definition I've seen, the commercial element is a strong one. So removing commerce from a destination means whatever it isn't a town centre anymore. One of the challenges we have in this country, the reason why permitted development, when it comes to something which changes the character, such as residential, is a challenge, is because we have fragmented property ownership. If there were better partnerships between landlords and people such as planning, licensing, landowners, community businesses, we're all on the same page, all with a unified vision, then actually have as much flexibility as you want to get things done, that's fine. Yeah. But that's not the framework we have. And when you have this level of fragmentation, giving people the power to do what they want in a free-for-all, it's regressive. For me, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And just finally, on the point of what happens once it turns residential, I think because of the rules, I'm told, because of the rules around residential, if it turns resi, very unlikely to ever turn back. Very unlikely to ever turn. It's not like commercial property. The rules around resi are different. So once you break that character, it is broken for good, or at least for generations. So yeah, I agree with everything you say.
Well, let's come back to this point after Mike and Sacha, because I think there's one really worth exploring.
Yeah, good idea. And actually, before we lose Mike and Sacha, I've got had a couple of questions on the chat around this, and it was about kind of, this is coming in from government, it's not a local decision, so actually what can we do about it? I'm going to take the spirit of that question and fire it to Mike and Sacha, which is basically, we've got regulators, we've got bid managers, we've got people involved in sort of supporting the licensed trade, pub watch chairs, etc. Have you got some kind of quick ideas around what those people can practically do to support our sector to recover and to be successful and be an agent of kind of regeneration for our towns and city centres? That's the golden question. I'm going to hand it over to Sacha first.
Do you know what? I think we've proven since lockdown one that together, if anything, it's galvanised the industry, it's galvanised all authorities. And I think just, Mike's better at answering this question, to be honest. He's done far more lobbying, but I think we can most definitely prove that combined, we can make a difference. And again, I talk about the 10 p.m. curfew, and I talk about, the substantial meal. I think it's proven that Westminster, Whitehall doesn't always make the right decisions. We know our town centres far better than they do. We're lucky that in some areas of the country we've got metro mayors. There's one in Liverpool, there's one in Manchester, one in Birmingham, one in London, obviously. We know our town centres better. So we should have more responsibility. We should have more devolved powers up here and not being given these powers direct from government.
So perhaps actually taking some learnings from areas like Croydon, where Croydon Bid were very deeply involved in the Raise the Bar sort of lobbying and campaigning around the grants cap that existed. So is it perhaps what you're saying is, getting involved in that conversation and pushing some examples up and trying to help support those big issues and making government more aware of them? Is that something locally that people could do, is that you think would be useful? Absolutely.
And I don't, I think towns should be working with each other. I don't want to get into the whole north-south divide because it just opens up an explosive debate. But absolutely, it doesn't sit right for me that people, I'm not going to say down south, people in Whitehall are telling us what to do in Manchester, or telling us what to do in Leeds, or telling us what to do in Newcastle, because people in those areas know what's better for us. But yeah, definitely, we should be supporting each other.
Great, thanks. I'm going to knock over to Mike. What practical ideas for what the people on this call can do to support the trade to recover?
I think the challenge that you've got, and something we've suffered from for a long time, is it's misconception and ill-informed decision making, and that's got to be generated from a local base. So it really just the significance of regional sort of understanding of what's going on nighttime economy and hospitality wise has to be the driver towards the central government position, because that's the only way that we're going to dispel or get over some of the broad brush approaches that we've seen from central government. And I think the challenge in terms of nighttime economy, particularly our representation, has got to come from that regional understanding of exactly what those environments look like. And that's going to take some community collaboration, industry collaboration, accessibility, reasonable approach, and the important thing, which is something we've learned as an industry, is communication. The communities that we've represented over the last couple of 12 months has grown phenomenally, but what we've realized very clearly is that a lot of central government don't really understand our industry very well. When I sit with DCMS and start talking to them about electronic music, and the question comes out of what's the value, how much is it worth? And I'm talking to the culture department for our country, who doesn't understand some of the key sort of genres or movements that happen within in the UK. So there is a worry that these decisions are very much ill-informed. They're being driven, which are very risk averse, and they're without having some sort of information passed on a regional base, and that regional base drive has got to, and we've seen examples from Croydon, we've seen many examples in the north. Sacha has done an amazing job with Andy to get across the very clear position of not only hospitality but nighttime economy, and we need to see more of that. More of that is going to have a stronger movement, more representation. We've recently seen Carly Heath be put into Bristol as a nightlife advisor. Sacha has done an amazing job. He's without a doubt been one of the shining lights within this very tough period. Amy's obviously doing what she's doing in London, and we need to see more of that representation, because I do see very clearly within bids and local authority, there is almost, all right, how do I manage the nighttime economy? And that has to be, we have to get involved as an industry, but we also need the bids and the local authorities and the town centre management to come to us as a collective and start driving this messaging centrally. And that just reinforces the position that needs to be undertaken. We need a more collaborative effort. That includes police, regulators, etc. But it's got to be driven from a regional base. That's vitally important, because as Sacha and Dan and everyone quite rightly said, they're the only ones who really understand what's going on the ground. And that's what they need to hear, not a central perspective or hearsay from 3 or 4 fold down the line with no difference between north, south, Midlands. We need to be clear, and there needs to be some regional perspective, and that needs to come from the local authority and the representation there. So sorry about that.
Just just before we leave, before Mike and I jump off, because I didn't realise there were going to be local authorities and police on this call. My ask to them will be this across the whole of the UK. You know, the nighttime economy has been dealt the worst blow ever, and that includes World War II. World War II, theatres were open, people were encouraged to go out and dance, to enjoy themselves. Entertainers didn't have to go out, conscription, they were kept here to entertain people. What I say is the local authorities and the police, they must take a pragmatic view to help operators across the country, because they need the help right now. And I am seeing time and time again, I'm not going to use the word bullying, but the tactics, they're wrong. Now, even in Manchester, we had police going around measuring the size of pizza slices to see if they're a substantial meal. It's nonsense, it's ridiculous. And I would just say we all need to work together to help the nighttime economy thrive and get back on its feet.
Thank you very much. That's a really strong, powerful partnership message, and a really important one. I'm sure we'll explore a bit more after you two have left. But thank you so much for your time. Good luck with what you're doing this afternoon, both of you. And Sacha, I presume that my Brits tickets are in the post, are they?
They're in the post. If anyone's from Manchester, vote Andy Burnham. Bye.
Take care. Thanks, guys.
See you later.
Great. Okay, so luckily we are hanging on to three of the most important panelists, so we can continue the discussion. I think one thing that it would be great to focus on, and that we're hearing through the chat, is what are the things that the people that are attending this call, what can they do and how can they influence? And we wanted to go back to this idea of policies and decision making and that kind of stuff, and how that affects recovery. So I know, Dan, you said there was more to be said about it. Is it something that you want to pick up?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, as I say, if I can just look at what we've done here, you know, I've been every week walking around with our licensing sort of teams, you know, from local authority, and actually with planning as well, because I have been getting them in the same room together to try and stop what, you know, what we were discussing before, because, you know, the main road that we operate on used to be double the size, and it was actually, thinking about what OJ said, it was right. It was all retail, sort of, you know, bars and retail, going right down to what used to be a pier at the bottom of the road, which is now gone. In the 90s, a lot of these, because this area was ravaged with heroin in the 80s, and you know, government didn't care less, but they ended up compulsory purchasing the bottom half of the road and turning it into houses. So we've got a real mismatch of housing and the last remnants of sort of you know, the washed out seaside town. That's what we sort of took up. And one of the things that we've done is we've started converting some of the flats that we have here to art studios and things, and bringing more business back to the high street. So we have on our high street, you know, pretty much everything had gone. So I'm sat in a bank now, an old bank. I've got 3 banks on the road with none of them are trading as banks. We've got bus stops that no buses go to. We've taken over every building that we took over was derelict or closed down. And the few little businesses that were hanging on, with people like the greengrocer Ian, who'd been there 47 years. We've got a post office, we've got a pharmacy, we've got an opticians, we've got a convenience store. So these are the last ones left. The big supermarket over the road has been closed for like 6 years. And we're looking at taking that over and putting about 200 new businesses in there and making it a supermarket with no big brands or anything in there, and a new start, so you can have an aisle, you know, a shelf, a gondola end, or a store or something. So we're trying to breathe vibrancy back into the place. We looked heavily at things like the broken windows, sort of policies in the early 80s in New York. We're writing our own one at the moment, you know, sort of our version of a regeneration. And I mean, it is concentrating on the little things. You know, what do people want? What are the human rights are? You know, things like lighting the streets, taking care of some of the little things, because they have a knock-on effect to people's behaviour, crime levels, people's sense of community. And one of the problems where it goes wrong in planning and licensing is where you do get this this mismatch, and shops and things close down, they end up getting converted, or you get the next round of the, you know, the brands in that get decided by, you know, someone sat in an office in Canary Wharf. They decide what people who live around here, what choice they have, you know, and it's trying to undo that afterwards is very difficult. So I think it's so important to get it right. We have an estate not too far, about 10 minutes away from here, and there's 8,000 people who live in that estate, and there's under 50 jobs, and there's not one venue or anything in that estate. So you have like a laundrette, a convenience store, a chippy, that's about it. The last pub closed and that's gone to another convenience store. So basically, if you live in that estate, you can't work there. Most people don't work there, and you can't socialise there. And you know, a lot of the architects, you know, they create, you know, the brutalist architecture we had, you know, like the Robin Hood estate and things like that in London. And these architects go and get pats on the back and awards, and they drink the champagne, celebrating, you know, how wonderful their building is. They don't have to live in it. Fast forward 10 or 20 years when you're just living in a concrete jungle and there's nothing for you to do, work or anything, and that breeds crime, you know. And a lot of the things I'm discussing here do have sort of an element of trying to bring a sense of community back. And the community is such a wider thing. It is about having some things on you, some base amenities on your doorstep. It's about feeling safe. It's about not having, if you don't drive, or in this case, there's no public transport, buses off. How do you actually look after a wide demographic of people who are old, people who are young? You know, I'm sitting in a bank now, there's no banks. If you're an older person on this road and the supermarket opened over the road, the greengrocer would shut and a number of others. And that means an old person would have to, you know, either walk down to the supermarket down the road, which is a bit of a hike for them. And even things like doctor's appointments, hospital appointments, all of these things impact on people's mental health, on their well-being. And we've just stored up a whole host of mental health issues and stress and things over the last, you know, 12 months or so. So this is why I think it's even more important to work with local businesses. And okay, because I'm a chairman of the Institute of Licensing, and because, you know, I have to immerse myself in this sort of stuff and I'm interested in it, you know, I have taken the sort of front foot, and I've got the, you know, the people of the council together and said, look, guys, how do we work together? You know, don't just, when we come out of lockdown, just have enforcement officers out there. Go in and see it as more of a partnership, because we all have to, you know, we're all trying to do the same thing. Good operators join things like NTIA, UK Hospitality, British Beer and Pub Association, Institute of Licensing, and they take the responsibilities seriously. And government has actually outsourced a lot of this through license to practice. So we need to work together. We've got to work together, and it's so multifaceted. There's not one silver bullet. It's about communication, and it's about trying some stuff, especially as some of these temporary measures will fall away. But actually, if it works better, you know, to have a few more tables out, and you're not blocking access for wheelchairs or anything like that. But if it makes it, you know, on one hand, if we had a few more tables out, but then we shut on a staggered basis, it's give and take. It's give and take that makes the place safer. That actually is ticking the licensing objectives, because it's ticking them on the basis that we are trying to keep, no one wants crime and disorder. No one wants, you know, because it reflects terribly on your business. Yeah. You know, if you've got a load of, you know, families, nice people out, and then there's disorder, it causes a lot of problems, and people just don't come back. I mean, I've been trying some music on the street. For any police officers on the call, there's a hint for you. Just get a string quartet where there's any sort of, you know, the undesirables hanging around, or a violin. A violin is like tear gas to scumbags. Literally, it just clears them away, or string quartet or something like that. I mean, you know, there is, I mean, pricing, lighting, music policy, you know, independence and communication are the most important thing.
Thank you. A good summary. And actually, when you were talking earlier about kind of increasing the understanding and licensing officers going in, or regulators going into licensed premises and that kind of thing, actually that applies, doesn't it, to everybody that's involved in decision making in an area. And I remember when I worked in Nottingham, one of the things that we did that was the most benefit was everybody that was involved, local councillors, lots of different planning department of the council, etc. Every so often we'd do a nighttime walk and we'd go around and visit the businesses that were operating late at night, and they'd meet these really inspirational, responsible operators and talk to them about how their business worked and what the issues were and what the opportunities were, and how they did provide the capable guardians that looked out for everybody, you know, in the nighttime economy, etc. And I just think having that common understanding and seeing firsthand that actually they're not all these kind of devious alcohol sprayers that, you know, want to sort of cause issues, and they will say also, you know, actually I don't want any irresponsible operators because it's bad for my business. I don't want trouble. So
one bad operator in a small area can affect every operator in that area in a negative way, because if you've got, you know, and we also, placemaking is another really important thing. So for example, we've got a few independent craft beer sort of bars, and they're clustered together. We've got, you know, there's something for everyone virtually there. You know, we've opened an art gallery, we've opened, you know, we've tried to do it on the basis that it's not mass volume vertical drinking, and also that it's not all about drink. It's actually about sort of culture, music, food, some retail, and alcohol is part of that, but it's not a big part.
Absolutely. No, you're right. Absolutely correct. I'm going to come on to Alistair in a minute, actually, because I know that Alistair's got some examples from other towns, cities, countries, etc., that will be really useful for people on this call about how you can start to affect change in the nighttime economy and some useful ways of doing that. However, we do have a panelist, a attendee with their hand up, which is Bill Dunn from Reading. So, Bill, I'm going to try and allow you to talk so you can ask your question. Thanks for waiting. We should be able to hear you.
Sylvia, I do apologise. It's probably a pocket fumble, and I don't have a question to ask. My apologies.
No problem at all, but nice to hear your voice, Bill.
Hi, Bill.
I'll turn you back on.
Hi, Bill.
In that case, I will hand over to Alistair with some of those examples we talked about.
Okay, yeah. So what I was thinking is, somebody, I think Johnny mentioned something about how do you make a better relationship between landlords, local authorities, investors, placemaking, and probably something OJ can come back in on as well. I think the very best places that I've either worked in or seen often have one larger landowner who has a vision for that place. And the challenge is so, okay, let's start with how that can work well. So if you look at Covent Garden in London, that's mostly owned by Capco. Okay. If you look at, I don't know, Chinatown in London, if you look at Seven Dials in London, if you look at, these are London examples, apologies for everyone else, I'll come around to other examples shortly, right? But it's where it works best, I think. If you look at Carnaby Quarter, Carnaby area in London, they're all owned by Shaftesbury. Then there's various places in like Regent Street, Piccadilly, which is Crown Estate. And then if you look at parts of Mayfair's and some of the nice little places in there, that's Grosvenor. And all of those landowners, Soho Estates in Soho, all of them have an idea about what it is how to get the mix right of stuff. And it's a bit like what Dan's doing in his neighborhood in terms of curating places. Okay, and this is kind of what's this elementary stuff here, right? In terms of getting the right mixture of retail, the right mixture of evening and nighttime economy, leisure and hospitality uses, community uses. What are you doing in terms of art, cinema, theatre, etc. But also investing in public space, the quality of a public realm, animating that public realm, designing it so it can host events. One of the challenges when we were hosting night markets all over London maybe 10 years ago was someone would have designed a brand new spanking place. It looked really lovely. And then we'd say, well, where's the water and the electricity? And they go, oh, well, we never did that. And it would cost us, you know, £600,000 to retrofit all that in. Well, perhaps you should have designed that into your public spaces when you were designing them 2 years ago. And so those landowners have, and I saw OJ nodding his head, they've managed to do that. Okay, it's not without struggles, particularly as they're in London and they're very much reliant on international tourism and business tourism, office workers. So it is possible, and as Dan's proven, it's also possible. I think there's other good examples at Altrincham, the market there. It's quite a famous one in terms of how that's been turned around, and how that then becomes a catalyst for attracting a more diverse new set of users into your town, how you can open up something that's a daytime facility and make it work and sweat that acid in the evening is also another interesting way of thinking about, you know, our towns and city centres. So I think that's some examples. So I apologise that quite a few of them are London. And I think the other one, and OJ might talk to this, which is that I think Stockton-on-Tees, the council there have decided to, they've got a shopping centre which is kind of got low vacancy, high vacancy rates, low occupancy rates, and they're sort of thinking about how they can reconnect by knocking that down the high street with the town centre, create a public space. And of course, there are a whole sets of implications because there's people using those facilities, there's people who run businesses in them still. And then there's losing of income revenue streams for councils who are over the last 10 years have really been crushed by, you know, in terms of lack of finance. So that's quite a challenge, but I think that's the way we've got to start looking at town centres, which is that how do we reimagine some of the things, because that retail is never coming back in the way that it is at the moment. Can we consolidate it in other parts of the town? Can we open things up? Can we provide entertainment, much better lighting? So Lenny was on here from New York, who I collaborate with, and she's, you know, she's the sort of leading expert around the world for how you use lighting to bring people in, you know, families, to support events, to support tourism, etc., etc. So for me, that's how we need to start thinking about town centres, rather than simply what do we fill some gaps with, you know, because there's a panic going on, which is that we've got a lot of gaps appearing in our town city centres, worse than ever before, and what we're going to put in them. And as OJ rightly says, what we shouldn't be putting them in is random housing. What I would also say, though, is that one of the things that we have been arguing for, both AJ and I and many others over the last 10 or 15 years, is we do need more residential in town and city centres, because they're the people who are going to shop in the shops, going to go down to Dan's restaurants and his bars, and you know, he gets it, and we need that in a cohesive way. So we do need more residential, but just the right type of residential, which is a circular point back to OJ's point, which is that's why you have planners who have control over what goes where. And sometimes it's frustrating working with them, but the point is that they're experts in it and you can challenge them. It's a democratic system. And at the end of the day, you know, it's not a free for all. And that's what I'm worried about, as OJ is worried about, is that we end up with a free for all, because really good quality investors like to invest in a place where there's a framework, right? They're not interested in making a quick buck. They're in it for the long term, whether that's Dan or whether that's Shaftesbury or the Crown Estate. They're in it for a long time. And that's what my concern about the kind of current planning regulation or deregulation processes. So I can come back to some more others, but maybe I can hand back to you and to OJ, Sylvia.
Sure, yeah. OJ, do you want to pick that up?
Yeah, as is often the case, I think Johnny B with his question on partnership was excellent, and Ali has hit the nail on the head with the answer. So just I'll start off by talking about the Stockton on Tees example, because it's something we've actually explored within ATCM at a recent virtual meeting. And in Stockton, they've actually got 2 shopping centres, one of which is I think both are suffering in terms of vacancy rates. And what one of the centres does is it closes the public's access to the riverside. So they've decided to work with the businesses to move the businesses from the shopping centre that sits on the riverside into the other shopping centre, that one that will be left empty, not to refill it with more of the same, but to demolish it completely. Open up the space, clean up the river, the community get a riverside, In some of that open space, they can use it for events, they can use it for community activities. They will transform it into an urban park for the community. And ultimately, I think from the soundings I've taken from the bid, the businesses are actually really happy with that, because that will create a footfall generator that will get people in. It's a fantastic scheme. The reason why it's able to happen is because Stockton for a while has brought up key strategic assets within its town centre, including the shopping centre itself. It owns most of its own town centre, so it's able to move forward with this plan. It is not an accident that Ali's just given us lots of examples from central London, because in various destinations in central London, you have single sort of property ownership. You don't have the challenge of fragmented property ownership. Therein lies the problem. It is about that fragmentation of who actually owns the assets in our town centres. You ask the question, who owns our high street? And that's when you start to understand how change happens, why it happens, and all the challenges we have currently at the moment. And outside of central London, there's too many areas where that fragmentation continues to be a problem. And it's why something like permitted development rights gets everybody nervous, because there is no chance you're able to deliver on any sort of compelling strategy or vision for a town centre if every single different property is owned by a different company or individual. And that's the challenge. So how do we create the type of partnership that is going to work for even in a nighttime economy, community, businesses, whoever else it might be? That is, we need stronger partnerships between property owners, so they're all working together, they all have a similar vision and can help us to regenerate our town centres in the right way. But then you also need better partnerships with property owners. So that is stakeholders like different parts of the council, be it licensing or planning or economic development or highways. It's better partnerships with the businesses, the occupiers, operators. It might be transport operators, it might be community residents, whatever it might be. Those partnerships between and with property owners are critical. And that's the next stage, I think. That's the next stage of evolution for the place management industry, is to look how we make property owners a key part of the public-private partnerships we rely on to drive forward change in our town centres. It's absolutely fundamental. We recently have involved the British Property Federation in some of our virtual calls as a membership body, and they're all up for this. They see the challenges, they're on the same page. They've actually referred to themselves and their members as placemakers, and they want to see better holistic solutions for property owners going forward in terms of working together and creating destinations that work in the whole, rather than allowing a free-for-all, which in the long term, many property owners will say, doesn't actually benefit the value of their asset. Because if you don't have that strategic vision, then you don't have the same level of interest in that property. And as Ali said, investors are in it for the long term. They need that framework to be able to invest with confidence. That's what the British Property Federation are looking for. They see placemaking as good placemaking as that framework, part of that framework that they need to rely on.
Thanks, OJ. I guess the $64,000 question then for you is: do you have your own ideas about how to engage them? Is there kind of a best practice model of that? Is it, because obviously, am I right in thinking that, for example, with business improvement districts, often if the property is vacant, then it would be the owner that would be paying the levy, and there's an opportunity that way because they are kind of inherently tied into that model? Or, you know, how would you recommend that places do incorporate that important sector in their conversation and strategy?
It's a real challenge. So in terms of that, you bring up the levy. So actually that is related to one of the main challenges we have, is that there is no actual tax on property owners that exists across the UK, which is why there's so many properties where we're not even entirely sure from first glance who actually owns the property. it's meant the Ministry of Housing is having to push forward with things like a landlord register, so we can better understand who owns what, and then we can get that engagement. I think the last stat I saw, this was going back a few years, was that about a third of the properties across England and Wales, it wasn't clearly identifiable who the actual owner of that property was, which speaks to a challenge we have. It's changed in London particularly because there was the business rate supplement which was levied upon property owners in order to fund Crossrail. So that then opened up the opportunity to be able to deliver property owner bids in London, but doesn't exist outside of London. So we need to think of how that looks like. My idea is that a lot of areas would probably have to start off with something like a landlord forum, where you can start just by getting people around the table to discuss ideas, to discuss shared visions, challenges, solutions, and then to take things forward to look at then more formal models whereby property owners can come together, help each other to mitigate risk. So, for example, if one property owner decides what the area needs might be a community use, post office, whatever it might be, but it's something which is actually lower yield, so that property owner might not necessarily make the type of return on investment they could do if they just went with the same thing everybody else went with. That there's some way we can mitigate the risk with other property owners, because ultimately everybody benefits if you get the right diverse mix in that town centre.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, to give you an example, say through the 70s, 80s, 90s, one of the challenges we had with town centre, the reason why we got this saturation of retail is because at the time, retail was the thing that delivered the highest return on investment. So what did property owners all go with? All retail. Retail starts to struggle. All of a sudden, we got saturation of, I think you mentioned it, I think it was you that mentioned it earlier, Sylvia, but the chain restaurants all came in, or maybe it was Ali that mentioned that. You get lots of chain restaurants coming in, all the same brands in all various town centres across the country. And then obviously the market eventually falls out with that. To avoid that, you need that partnership between property owners to make sure we get that diverse mix, rather than clone towns. It's absolutely critical we're able to get to that stage.
Do you know what? You've actually said a number of really good things there that make total sense to me here. I mean, we've wrestled with this when we're trying to develop the area, in that we bought up or leased every boarded up building in the street. And we're actually dealing with some of them. There's a number of absent landlords or people who have, in a couple of cases, never even set foot in New Brighton. For them, it's just on a spreadsheet, and they live abroad or they live in London, and it's just one of a number of assets. Now, these are people who, you know, it's hard to get. We actually got a bit of a forum, exactly what you said there, where we got some of the business owners and landlords together, as many as we could, and talked about, and we're doing that at the moment, going round and trying to create some distinct different neighbourhoods within New Brighton, have different offers. And I think now, because we've actually been walking the walk and doing it, we've spent a fair amount of money now, and a lot of that has been on public realm stuff, you know, planting flowers, you know, bringing areas that have got that the council owned in effect, that were just dumping grounds with fly tipping and things, making them, getting the local kids involved and things to get them off the streets and to do something positive. All of this is good, but it's so crucial that you do get that sort of communication, because you only need one or two rogue landlords, or you know, to go and undermine what the whole area is trying to achieve, and the people who live there, you know, want. I'd love to pick up after this actually with you guys, because I think that I'd be interested to, you know, to show you around here and explain what we're doing and get some advice from you. You know, from you both, particularly on the lighting as well. I was really interested what you said there, because it's been a constant battle with me and the local authority. We had 60% of our street lights around, 60%. Now that means off you know, the main high street, there's whole areas, residential areas, where you literally can't see, you know, 3 or 4 feet in front of you. And it was got so bad that I used to leave all the lights on all my premises on all night, from a safety point of view. You know, and as I explained to local authority, it's damn sight cheaper to replace a light bulb than it is to, you know, pay out for a hip replacement or a broken, you know, collarbone or something, which was happening all the time. You have a bad spell of weather. But also, I think it's more of a fundamental human right, you know, and you feel, you know, safer. You illuminate buildings that you just walk past. You can do that with art as well, street art, that might look a bit tired, but actually the beautiful buildings, if you just brought them to light, you lit them correctly and things. And I think also people feel safer. They're less likely to cause antisocial behaviour. They don't litter as much. You know, I think it's just such an important part, you know, of many parts of turning the place around. It's really, really interesting stuff what you're saying.
Yeah, can I just go back on that quickly?
Sorry, Jay. Go on.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I totally agree on the issue of lighting. I think the sad case of Sarah Everard, for me, reinforces the fact that we need to think about safety at night.
Absolutely.
Something as simple as the right lighting. We had a discussion with Michael Kill about this, that you can use lighting in so many ways to make people feel safe and secure, but also even as part of a sensible dispersal strategy. You can illuminate the streets you want people to take when they're leaving a town centre destination, especially when some parts of our public transport infrastructure at night might not be fully up to capacity yet. You can use lighting strategies as part of that dispersal. So we need to get serious about that. We need to do that properly.
I'm really, really interested in continuing this. Yeah, offline. Yeah. That's a very, very good point.
Absolutely. And then just on the property point as well, I think, again, Dan, you're right. We have a mix of property owners. Some of them are rogue. Some of them are just absentee landlords who, for them, it is just something that is on their bottom line. They don't really care. They're not bothered, and they're difficult to work with. They're even difficult to identify. But I think there's many out there who are not just concerned about what's happening with their asset, but they are more than willing to jump in, roll up their sleeves and get involved. I would actually say there's a number of property owners out there who actually want some sort of vehicle, some sort of structure that they can use to pool their investments so they can invest in the public realm to ensure that they're getting the return on investment they need over the 10, 15, 20 years that they're looking at. It was when the conversation started in Parliament about how we introduce business improvement district legislation in the UK, starting off with England, property owners lobbied hard for property owners to be the ones putting in the money because they wanted that vehicle for investment. Now, because of the lack of a property tax, they weren't able to take that forward. The government had, at the time, had to go with it being business occupiers. But that issue hasn't gone away. There's still lots of property owners out there that want some sort of vehicle to invest in. And maybe the idea of some sort of, the way it works for bids in terms of occupiers is businesses pool their investments. And if based on a sort of double lock majority, more than 50% of businesses in an area say yes to a bid, then the freeloaders have to pay up as well. Maybe there's some sort of similar vehicle we look at for property owners whereby those that want to get things done can vote yes, and if there's more than 50% of them are compelled to do so, then legally the freeloaders have to invest as well. Maybe that's something we need to look at.
Why don't we potentially do a little pilot project here? Because I think that you know, on a small scale there, but I mean, I think all of this plays in exactly to make the places safer. It makes them more sustainable. It makes them nicer to live, work, enjoy your recreational time in. But no, it's very, very interesting, that.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, isn't it? And actually, there's a broader point to be made here in that I think what we're all saying is, for the people that are on the call, it could, I guess, be tempting to just think about how you're going to fill your vacant premises and what's going to kind of, how you're going to sort of grow from a property vacancy perspective and businesses and what the offer is. But actually, all the things that sit around that, we mustn't take our attention off that. And what was really exciting before the pandemic is that all those things, and Alistair, I'm sure, will come in and talk a bit more about them, but places were getting more interested in how they can use things like lighting, like OJ said about, you know, directing people down streets, or even sort of projecting signage to say, be quiet, people live here, you know, at night, and stuff like that. And being really creative and thinking about all the kind of extra stuff you can put around a nighttime economy to make it safer, more vibrant, more interesting, different, give it a sense of place. And I wouldn't like to see that lost just because people are so focused on filling the vacancy. So I don't know if I want to hand over to Alistair, because I'm sure you've got something to say about that, being a placemaker yourself.
Yeah, I don't think it will get lost. I think people understand that. I think when you go through a crisis, people are firefighting, right? So that's what we're doing at the moment. So therefore, sometimes when you're outside the firefighting, you feel that people are not being strategic enough, or partnership enough, or together enough. But people are just, you know, the priority list changes, right? But as we come out of it, in theory, there should be some form of normalization, and hopefully we can go back to the things that we've been preaching for many years now. I think, yeah, I won't speak about lighting just now, because OJ's done quite a good job of highlighting some of the value of that. And Lenny, who I work with, Lenny Schwendiger, who was on the call earlier and made a couple of comments, she's unfortunately had to go, and that's really her area of expertise. I've learned a lot from her recently about that. I thought I knew a bit about lighting, but when you find a real expert, it's amazing. And that really is about animating particular spaces, using it around safety. I think we need to be careful that, you know, lighting and designing out crime type stuff can't, you know, change, you know, all of society's behavior. We've got bigger conversations to have around that. But certainly, you know, if you do an effective audit of your town or area, and Dan's might be a good case study that everyone on the call can actually have a look at in due course, you know, you can actually look at, you know, very quickly you can identify a lot of problems with lighting. You know, it's incredible how quickly and how poorly understood it is as a way of creating a sense of place, safety, and attractiveness. You know, it's massively underrated. And I think, you know, over the next 10 or 20 years, it will become, it's already a discipline for sure, but I think it'll become mainstream discipline. I know Lenny feels like it's this kind of, she feels like she's, you know, I guess like many of us were about the nighttime economy 10 or 15 years ago, she feels like, you know, kind of shouting into literally the dark in her case. And I think that is starting to change a bit. I suppose it's worth picking up, like David has made a really good point around some of the curation of those spaces in London I was talking about earlier, and about the Licensing Act, and how if all of the permissions, or all what everybody wanted under the Licensing Act or prior to the Licensing Act were given, those licenses were given out, then we'd have a very different place in terms of levels of crime and disorder and antisocial behaviour in those London places. And I think it is interesting because one of the things that a lot of those landlords have been able to do when they've got that partnership and they have collective ownership is that they've been able to pick and choose who they put in. They have much tighter controls on the behavior of the operators within their own spaces, often having operating schedules which they are much in excess of what you would expect legally to be compliant with licensing and with the police, which I think is really interesting. And operating management plans per venue. So a lot of those venues now have those. And if you breach those as an operator, then you're in breach of your lease, not just in breach of your license with the police and the licensing authority. So I think there's a lot more control, and you can create the kind of people that you want operating in your premises. And I think that's really important because then you are able to get the right mix of who is being attracted to the area. And one of the things that I repeatedly say in licensing appeals, and when I'm asked to speak to that and to write reports about it, is it's the type of operation that attracts the type of customer, right? It's not what time it opens until, it's not what it sells, etc. What attracts in the right kind of people is the right kind of operation, okay? And that is fundamental. It's not simply about the nuts and bolts of someone's license in terms of the hours that it's open, the number of days, the capacity even. All of that is often used as a reason to perhaps to turn down a license. But for me, it's the caliber of the operator, the quality of the offer, and who is the target audience. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is I think Britain is changing quite rapidly in terms of what they want from an evening and night out. It's not quite what it was 15 years ago, where it was, you know, I'm going to go out, and what Professor Fiona Measham called determined drunkenness, that the purpose of going out for the evening was to get drunk, and hopefully you'd find a taxi to get you home, or your mates would look after you, etc., or you get picked up by a street pastor. Okay, some of that still happens, I'm not denying it doesn't, but there's definitely a demographic change. Younger people, who are predominantly the people who were both victims and sometimes the perpetrators of some of those problems, their idea of what they want from an evening out and what they want from their life is radically different to even people in their 30s, let alone people as old as me. So maybe that's something on there. I can come back in on some of the other things if you want in due course.
Great. And Dan, I guess, is that something that you've noticed in your exploration into New Brighton, that your different, say, audience demographics or age bands want different things? Do you see a lot of the younger audience, are they accessing the same kind of leisure offer as perhaps the traditional, the determined drunkenness, as Alistair said, or have you noticed a marked difference?
Well, we've got we have a fairly eclectic mix of offers down here that does really create a fairly, wide spectrum of people that come down here, and that's what we wanted. We wanted to be able to be a destination for people to spend time and feel safe and have choice, mainly through independence and independent offers. And also a few quirky sort of places. So we haven't knocked anything down. We've refurbished buildings, and because we've bought taken over a number of ex-banks and things like that, and all different types of building. What we've done is try and house a number of other businesses within them. So we've sort of given seed funding to like little new start businesses. So if you look at Rockpoint Records, that has a vinyl record store in, a bar, two food offers, a gin distillery downstairs, a barber shop, a tattoo parlor, and 3 art studios. So that's just one place. Now there's two of that we run, and the others are all independent businesses. And that's just in one building. Next door, we've got an art gallery with a bar/venue at the back of it. And that's over 2 floors. And then the top floor is a silkscreen printing room. So we bought a load of old silkscreen printing equipment. We've got a photography dark room that we've put in. We've got, some retail apparel offers. We've got the traditional pub, James Averton, Habibi, a restaurant over the road, just like a Middle Eastern concept, and we've got some outside areas. And then we've encouraged some of the younger people who have got ideas where we do like pop-up food offer. So different weekends, we'll have a different person who comes along and says, I want to be outside and do a barbecue. I want to do something, a particular food offer. And in some cases, we've helped them set up, their own businesses like that. And so it is a bit of a mismatch. Like that, but what we try and do is have it, art is a big thing here. So we've got about 28 full murals on the sides of buildings, and these are by some of the best artists in the world, a number of local artists, but also some of the, people who've come in from Australia, America, France. We've got 2 French artists here today. And again, even the art that they do, it's something for everyone. It's not all really contemporary sort of modern stuff. It's, everything from portraits to street art. And I think there's a difference between vandalism and graffiti and curated art. You won't see any vandalism down here. Because one of the things we did at the start was we got all the kids who were causing problems. And the first year, we just literally cleared fly tipping up. We painted lampposts, painted benches, sanded things down. And they're less likely to vandalise something that they've actually helped restore. So there is a bit of a mix, down. There's on the promenade itself, there's a couple of places that cater. I mean, there's no real nightclubs here anymore. And that means people would have to go to Liverpool. And we could probably do with a nightclub, but finding the right place. There's a couple of places I'd look at. you know, but again, we want to be considerate to the neighbours. We want to work with them. So we spend a lot of time just walking them down the roads. We write to every resident, giving them updates, and we have an open door policy. Just come in and see us. But we've one of the things we've looked at as well is, especially with lockdown, we engage the pub itself. I mean, we have like dementia days. We have, you know, we have calls from people around the world saying that, you know, my mum died a few years ago and my dad's on his own and we live in Australia or Canada, and we just want to thank you because you've been sending a taxi to pick him up every week to come in to watch the match and then taking him home. We have a real sense of community here, and I think that there's no one silver bullet in any things like this with regeneration. It's lots of little things coming together and being, you know, I live on the road, you know, just up the road. So, you know, I want the place to be nice. One of the challenges we've got is that we've just been top of the list by Rightmove. This particular area here has spiked in property values more than any other in the country, in the whole of the UK in the last 12 months. So I don't want to gentrify it too much, where you have people who don't live in the area who are just coming in and speculating and buying and stopping people from actually. The whole point of this was to, you know, was to really give a place for people from here to live, start businesses and operate and go. So, you know, dealing with that is an issue as well, but you know, it's just one of those things, I suppose.
So some interesting themes there then. So really a lot of the offer that you have down there is drinking is a secondary activity to another purpose.
Yeah, but it's in a place. I mean, for example, in our pub, we do history talks. We do, you know, we do like, we try and just not make it about drink. You know, so it's not just all about drink. You know, we have a number of licensed premises there, but we're normally sort of, you know, there's more than just alcohol there. There's, you know, food offers or retail mixed in with them.
Yeah. And I think that's true in a lot of places. I'm sure OJ would agree that's really a shift that we've seen, you know, rippling across the country. And I think that's something that sometimes people that perhaps this is another reason why going out and seeing your local nighttime economy, if you are in, you know, in the placemaking group of people, if you're a decision maker, is really useful, because actually sometimes what the nighttime economy is used for is very different from what people perceive that it's used for, and how that all works. And the other one that I loved is your creative use of community. And I think there's, particularly now, I imagine after COVID, there's going to be a real sense that people want to support and help and give back and shape and be part of the conversation, be part of, you know, the team that helps to bring their town or city centre back into.
An example, we picked up a load of old Davies from the nursing home and gave them all free haircuts because the hair was all over the place. I haven't got around to mine yet, but so things like that, you know, when we've got building work going on, if somebody needs, you know, if our builders are working on something and if they see somebody trying to fix something, you know, we'll just go and do it for them or help them and stuff like that. But we use local builders as well, and people who live in the area. We try and use not, you know, the big companies. So I think that because we've done so many talks as well to the residents and to people, we've been on the radio, we've been, you know, we've been communicating the plan, saying, look, we're not property developers, you know, I bought a load of a property without even doing a bloody survey on it, and some of it's really come back to bite me. But it was more important. I didn't want anywhere shut. I didn't want just a road boarded up, and so there's places that we're not developing yet. One of the banks we've got, and we've had pop-up art galleries in, like photo exhibitions where people can bring in photographs and memories and things of the place. Because New Brighton, you know, for 28 years I worked in London, and if someone asked me where New Brighton, where I lived, I just said Liverpool, and yet 50 years ago, everyone would have known where New Brighton was because it was the third largest seaside town with 2 piers, 11 theatres, the largest open baths in the world, the largest ballroom in Europe. You know, the Grosvenor in Park Lane sits about 1,300 people. The New Brighton Tower sat 3,500 people. The tower on top was the biggest in the country, bigger than Blackpool. So, you know, all of these things, when, you know, we're taking over here, every one of those assets is gone. every single one of them. So, you know, where the biggest baths in the world is Morrison's. And it's not a compelling, as I said to the council, they did this development on the front, which consists of a load of like mid-range brands. And that is not a compelling reason to visit Eastside Town anywhere, because all of those offers you can get just about anywhere, you know, and, you know, and again, so it's about what we have to get together and say, what is New Brighton? Let's get together and let's talk about what is the offer. Let's get all the, you know, interested parties together and say, we're doing a 15-year plus plan. It's going to be sustainable. What is the offer? What do we want it to be? And that's what we're in the detail of going through at the moment.
Yeah, and I think that's a good approach for any town, city, place to look at, isn't it? Is bringing together you know, who are the key players, or not even the key players, who are all the players that are interested in getting involved in this? What kind of forum could be created to make sure that they have an opportunity to be involved, and how do you best make use of all that energy and experience and enthusiasm, and how can you bring that all together? And I think that's the challenge that a lot of places have got ahead of them, but hopefully
you shouldn't ever underestimate as well the amount of people. When we started this mad project, the amount of people, particularly retired, who came along, knocked on the door and said, right, we want to help. Yeah. You know, I've had a career in X, Y, or Z. I've got a skill set that's transferable. I want to come in and just help you out. We had people who had left New Brighton, you know, 20, 30 years ago, and just said, you know, in lockdown, they've come back to see family and residents. And I go, we love it around. It's completely transformed. And you know, what can we do to help? So you get a certain momentum where people go, actually, we want this to happen. That in itself puts some pressure on the council as well to do the right thing.
I mean, I don't know if this might be a stretch too far, and perhaps I shouldn't be asking on live, but we talked earlier about you often have people come to see what you've done in New Brighton, but it strikes me that there are probably a lot of people on this call, and I know a lot of other people that all of us work with would be interested. I wonder if it might be worth trying to organise some kind of study trip to come.
I was going to suggest that, because just off the call, and particularly to, you know, listening to, I mean, I know Mike and Sacha and I, you know, are speaking on a weekly or daily basis. What Alistair has said, and OJ in particular, you know, really, really interesting. And I'd love them to come up. I mean, actually, I want to engage with both of them, because you know, I'd like some advice. I'd like them to come and sit here. But also, we have things like the Floral Pavilion Theatre, which we're looking at taking over. It loses £1 million a year at the moment. This is a classic example that it's a theatre, but there's not enough hotel space for people to come. So if you have a conference, there's not enough hotels. Hotels won't build until there's more other things to do here. And you have this sort of like, you know, chicken and egg sort of thing. And so we could put a conference on, you know, or you know, study tour things. And I'd love to do that. I mean, what you do at Best Bar None is brilliant. And again, people who join things like Best Bar None are the good guys, you know. And this is what I'd really say to any sort of like people in the council on the call. Try and get a you know, sort of a forum, and if you're going around and speaking to them, they've done something differently, ask them, you know, why, because often there's other reasons that aren't necessarily. Putting some more chairs out isn't just about, say, getting more trade. It can often be to actually deter something, or to, you know, to manage, you know, traffic flow or whatever. You know, there's lots of different reasons that you do things, and I think if you work in a collaborative, you know, sort of, you know, with thinking behind it, you know, I think that is definitely the order of the day coming out of the lockdown.
Yeah, I think it'd be lovely to be able to put something together that brings all of these examples from, you know, bring them together, because I talk to a lot of places that are almost trying to reinvent the wheel and go from scratch, when there's so many learnings and great ideas out there that it would be great to harness it. So we'll put something together, and I think most people on the call have heard about this through you know, the partnerships I mentioned earlier, Best Bar None Institute of Licensing, etc. So we can put something together, maybe put it out to our networks. And well,
I'll happily host an afternoon, a conference, or whatever we want, a study tour, for anyone who's interested. And also, if there's anyone on the call who's, you know, is interested in talking to us, you know, just give us a shout, and welcome to come over anytime. sharing best practice is one of the most important things. And we got a lot. I went, you know, before I did this, I visited every seaside town in the UK, looking for, you know, what was going on before I did the select committee into the future of seaside towns. And I also went back over to the States and looked at, you know, both the East Coast and West Coast there of America, and, you know, and places, just to really, you know, get ideas and understand, you know, some of the challenges that we might have and need to overcome. Brilliant.
Yeah, and I know people like OJ and Alistair will have countless examples that would be so valuable to a lot of people on this call, and yeah, a lot of people that we work with. So yes, let's try and work to make that happen. One final question for Dan, and then I'll ask you if you have anything else to say to sum up each of you. But Dan, how did your conversation with the licensing team go about tables and chairs? Did they take a pragmatic approach? Were you okay leaving?
Yeah, they did, because it wasn't just them. I mean, but we were talking to the police as well, and I mean that was just one little thing. There's lots of stuff like that, and yeah, because it makes sense. It wasn't, you know, I didn't just say yes, you know, but I told them why we were doing it, and actually I took them onto the roof of one of the places, and we looked down at the whole area, and it's a lot easier to see now where there's pinch points, where there's potential problems, because you know what I've asked them to do. So it's optics as well. It's about saying, look, the council hasn't got everything right. And for most residents, actually, they're more concerned about like fly tipping, or they're more concerned about buildings being, you know, just boarded up, or you know, things like this, than they are about having a few tables and chairs. I think a lot of residents want to see that sort of vibrancy, because it's so much more. They also see the fact that, you know, the kids can go somewhere, they can go somewhere. And you know, work, there's jobs, opportunities, lots of different interests and things like that. And because we haven't just been driving, we haven't done any cheap drinks or anything like that, because it is secondary, you know, for us, it is more about sort of the experiential stuff.
Thanks, thank you. Alistair, anything else to add before we wrap up for the afternoon?
No, I was just going to quickly mention, Sagard asked this question about community leisure facilities. I don't necessarily have any grand answers at the moment, but what I do see is increasing amounts of investment, not necessarily in those. They're struggling because obviously through the pandemic, their income stream has been severely affected. They're obviously nearly always run by, well, it says community, but could be run by local authority, you know, leisure departments, etc. So they're struggling a bit. I'm wondering if there's an element, and maybe this is something OJ and other participants in the conversation can perhaps have a further discussion about, is how do we integrate greater amounts of leisure provision in town and city centres? Because you know, that's you know, as our Prime Minister found out to his detriment, is you know, being healthy is a great defence against a pandemic, and it's also a great defence against other forms of illness in your life. And so the role of health fitness is not going away anywhere. And I'm wondering how we can perhaps better integrate community facilities into our town and city centres over and above what we've already got, and making them more of a centrepiece rather than simply something that you drive to on the edge of a town and city centre, or something that is about private membership gyms, etc., who will always do. Maybe that's, you're right, Dan. Speaking of COVID, and maybe that's something OJ could perhaps have a thought about, because creating healthy places is not simply about, you know, having good quality food, having about active, you know, outdoor spaces, etc. It's also about having good quality leisure facilities that are at the heart of the community, not simply tucked away in the corner of a park or something. So that's a thought to end with, you know, in terms of creating rounded out, sustainable places. And maybe I can hand it over to OJ.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with that. I think there's lots about our town centres that need to change. I think the issue about integrating community leisure, again, I think part of that is making sure we have the partnerships in place that allow us to develop a proper vision for town centres and how they should work, and how they need to meet the needs of all the community. And I think in terms of when I talk about being able to mitigate the risk of some property owners that take a risk on maybe the lower yield assets, community leisure facilities is probably one of them. So we need to make sure we have the framework in place that allows those uses to come in. I think that's critical. And I think one thing I also want to say in summary as well, to bring things round full circle in terms of the slides Ali provided at the beginning. And if I remember correctly, Ali, my first engagement with you years ago was actually around the issue of the value of evening and nighttime economy from an economic perspective. For me, doesn't get nearly as much attention as it deserves. And I think one of the things we do need to consider, and you can hear it being voiced in this call, you can hear it being articulated in different ways, but there needs to be a culture change in terms of how evening and nighttime economy is viewed, how it's treated, because too often I think people on the outside see it as being something which needs to be regulated, suppressed. It's about vertical drinking. It's a challenge, it's a problem, which we need to keep in check, when really it should be about understanding the wide variety of activities that happen in the evening and nighttime economy, and understanding that it is also about economic growth. It's about jobs. It is about people's mental health and well-being, leisure, social experience. I think it wouldn't be unfair of me to say that actually good evening and nighttime economy is a trigger for inward investment. There are a number of things young people will look for in a place they want to study in, they want to work in. They will want things like good education and employment opportunities, good housing. I would bet the chance for good social experience is probably going to be in their top 3 of things they're looking for. So if you want the best talent, good evening and nighttime economy, we need to consider it as part of a critical ecosystem for the regeneration of local economies. And also, given what we've been through with COVID, we know there's real challenges with the visitor economy. If we're having to rebuild our visitor economy again, what's going to be key to that? Evening and nighttime economy is going to be critical. So let's stop thinking about it as something we need to just regulate and suppress, and let's start thinking about the figures Ali's presented us with, and understand that in and of itself, not only is it important, but in terms of an ecosystem around inward investment and visitor economy, it's an incredibly powerful tool for regeneration.
Excellent, thank you, OJ. So you've done a fantastic job of summing up the session. So it saves me a job, which is brilliant. No, that's excellent. Thank you so much. And we've been so lucky to have so many fantastic, all of your wisdom on this call, all of you that attended and gave your time. So thank you very much for the attendees. Thank you ever so much to the panelists. Really, really valuable. And let's try and make something happen, because I think the fact that so many different areas are going off and doing their own things, there's a real lost opportunity to all learn from each other, like Dan says, in terms of sharing best practice. Let's conserve our fighting pots for actually, carrying out these activities rather than planning them. If we can all get together, and share best practice and try and make some of the, share some of these initiatives across towns and cities, so that everybody can get on the bandwagon of regenerating and making the best out of the leisure opportunities, then all the better. So we will progress the conversation. Thanks ever so much, everybody, and have a lovely rest of the afternoon.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thanks,
Thanks, everyone.
Great conversation.
Fab. Okay, excellent. Well, that was good, wasn't it? Okay, I think, yes, that's that's it. You're on mute still. Sorry. It's one of those days.
That's me out every time. Ah, dear. You're recording still.
Oh yes.
Sylvia, I haven't got the recording from the